Something fascinating is unfolding in Ukraine right now. For the first time since the early days of the Russian invasion, it appears the Ukrainians are regaining the momentum. The Russian war machine, along with the economy propping it up, both seem to be cracking under the immense strain of a full-scale war now well into its fifth year. To put the crawling pace of Russia's recent advances into perspective, consider the timeline. During the first phase of the war back in 2014, Russia seized control of roughly 7% of Ukraine's territory. Then, in the opening weeks of the full-scale invasion in early 2022, that expanded dramatically to nearly 27% of Ukraine's territory at its peak, before successful Ukrainian counteroffensives pushed it back down to about 18% by November 2022. Over the 3.5 grinding, attritional years since then, Russia has only managed to seize another 1.5% of Ukraine's territory, paying an almost incalculable price in blood to do so. More than 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded just to conquer that extra 1.5% of Ukrainian land during this stretch. To put this in terms fellow Americans might grasp, Russia has spent 3.5 years and paid more than 1 million casualties just to conquer an area of land smaller than Los Angeles County in Southern California. Add in casualties from before November 2022, and total Russian losses, killed and wounded combined, have likely climbed past 1.2 million, with both British and Swedish intelligence estimating around 500,000 of those are deaths. In other words, around 3% of Russia's entire pre-war male population of fighting age has been killed or wounded in this war. That's a devastating statistic for any society, one that feels like it belongs in the 20th century rather than the 21st. And the pace of Russia's casualties has only been increasing. Since the start of 2026, according to Ukrainian sources, Russia has been averaging roughly 35,000 casualties on the front lines every single month, a rate now outpacing Russia's ability to find new recruits to replace them. This would be a massive game changer in the war if true, because throughout 2024 and most of 2025, Russia was still able to recruit more men than it was losing. Russia managed this through huge financial incentives for enlistment, particularly attractive in its less developed, poorer rural regions. Soldiers enlisting could earn up to 7 or 8 times the median annual Russian wage in just 1 year of frontline service, on top of generous debt forgiveness, free college tuition, and even land handouts. Throughout 2025, when Russia averaged closer to 23,000 casualties a month, these incentives were strong enough to find more than enough replacements. But now in 2026, with casualties at 35,000 a month, they haven't been enough. For the first time in this war, Russia is failing to fully replace its manpower losses. Ukraine's manpower losses have been numerically smaller, but even more catastrophic as a demographic share. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates Ukrainian casualties, killed and wounded, now number around 600,000, only about half of Russia's total. But that represents nearly 7% of Ukraine's entire pre-war fighting-age male population compared to Russia's 3%. This, in a nutshell, has been the brutal logic of Russia's attritional strategy adopted against Ukraine in November 2022. Russia's larger manpower and resources let it absorb much higher numerical casualties, while Ukraine was ground down by far higher demographic damage. Russia's bet was that this demographic toll would eventually cause Ukraine to break first, triggering a rapid collapse of the front lines, which is why Russia felt comfortable paying numerically higher casualties until then. But the problem for the Kremlin is that the longer this war drags on, and the longer Ukraine stubbornly holds out, the more damage it inflicts on Russia too, especially on an increasingly impatient population repeatedly promised a quick, decisive victory. In January 2026, what was initially billed as a 3-day special military operation passed the ominous 1,418-day mark, exceeding the length of the Soviet Union's entire war against Nazi Germany. Let that sink in for a moment. A conflict sold to the Russian public as something that would be over before the weekend has now outlasted the entire span of the Eastern Front in World War II, one of the most destructive military campaigns in human history. And if Russia is to achieve even its most minimal objectives, the war is likely to last years longer still. At the pace of advance achieved in 2024 and 2025, Russia wouldn't complete the conquest of the rest of eastern Donbass for another 2 or 3 years, pushing the war into 2028 or even 2029. Full control of Donbass remains the Kremlin's top war objective, one it has never been willing to compromise on, and Putin has reportedly ordered the military to finish the job by the end of 2026. That would require advancing far more rapidly than in 2024 and 2025 against significantly more heavily defended and reinforced urban Ukrainian positions. It's an extraordinarily tall order. Worse for the Kremlin, since April this year, Russia has actually started losing ground for the first time in years. In April, Russian forces suffered a net loss of 116 square kilometers of territory, the first monthly net territorial loss since the major Ukrainian counteroffensive 3 years earlier in 2023. They lost even more ground in May, and the comparison with the previous year's performance is striking. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces seized roughly 516 square kilometers between December 2024 and May 2025, while over that same window this year, they lost 280. Russian advances have ground to a virtual halt nearly everywhere along the front over the past couple of months, making the idea of Russia conquering all of Donbass by 2028, let alone by the end of 2026, as Putin has reportedly ordered, look increasingly far-fetched. So why is this happening now, and how much weaker is Russia than it appears on paper? Let's break down the contributing factors one at a time, because there are quite a few of them, and they're compounding on each other. First, Russia's economy is probably not doing as well as official government data suggests. Moscow claims GDP grew about 13% between 2020 and 2024, despite the war. But in a recent New York Times op-ed, Sweden's foreign minister, Maria Malmer Stenergard, wrote that Swedish government analysis of changes in Russia's nighttime satellite luminosity, essentially using how brightly lit up the country appears from space as an economic proxy, suggests the economy actually contracted by 8% over that same span instead. That's a massive discrepancy between the official narrative and what independent analysis suggests is actually happening on the ground. She also noted that while Russia's official 2024 inflation figure was just 10%, the central bank still hiked interest rates all the way up to 21% that same year, which suggests the real inflation problem is significantly worse than what's being reported. Currently, in mid-2026, Russia claims inflation of only 5.2%, but Sweden's military intelligence chief estimates the real figure is closer to 15%, nearly 3 times higher than what Moscow is admitting to. If that estimate is accurate, Russia's actual capacity for sustained military spending is much weaker than official numbers would have you believe. These inflationary pressures aren't likely to ease anytime soon either. With a sharp demographic downturn underway and heavy demand for manpower in both the military and the defense industrial base, competing for the same shrinking labor pool, this pressure will keep building as long as the war continues. And it's the ordinary civilian population that has to live with the consequences. As the war drags on with no victory in sight, casualties mounting, inflation persisting, and state repression intensifying through tighter internet and media censorship, Putin's approval rating is beginning to slide. Even official Russian state-controlled polling data shows it has fallen to 65.6%, down significantly from the 77.8% he held just before the invasion began, and well below the 80+% ratings he enjoyed for years before that. For an authoritarian system that depends heavily on the appearance of overwhelming popular support, that's a meaningful crack. Beyond the economic strain, Ukraine's evolving battlefield strategy since mid-2025 has also contributed heavily to these outcomes, simply because it's working exceptionally well. Over a year ago, in March 2025, Zelensky released a video describing a new approach, bringing the war back to Russia itself, shifting the burden of pressure onto Moscow rather than absorbing it all in Kyiv. Since then, Ukraine has largely abandoned its older strategy of costly ground counteroffensives, which were always extremely casualty-intensive and yielded diminishing returns, in favor of a longer-range, asymmetric approach designed to damage the Russian economy and civilian morale at home, rather than simply trying to retake territory yard by yard. After Russia captured the city of Avdiivka on the outskirts of Donetsk in early 2024, Ukraine was forced onto the defensive, facing crippling artillery shortages and frustrating delays in expected Western aid. Forced to adapt under pressure, Ukraine increasingly turned to small first-person view drones as a cheap, effective substitute for conventional artillery they simply didn't have enough of. Production scaled up rapidly, to the point where more than 150 Ukrainian manufacturers now build millions of these drones every year, with hundreds of thousands fielded along the front at any given time. Russia has matched this with comparable drone production of its own, and as a result, the entire 745-mile front line is now saturated with these weapons, forming what amounts to a kill zone roughly 15 to 30 meters deep that's nearly impossible for either side to penetrate safely. Nearly every square inch of that zone sits under constant aerial surveillance, swarming with explosive-laden drones ready to strike anything that moves. This has made the kind of mass armored breakthroughs that defined 20th century warfare virtually impossible today, and it's dramatically driven up casualties on both sides. Russia's more so, since it's the side still largely attempting to advance through it. The constant presence of these explosive drones in the kill zone also makes medical evacuation by helicopter or ambulance nearly impossible, leaving wounded soldiers stranded and untreated for hours or even days at a time. As a result, the ratio of wounded to killed has shifted dramatically, from roughly 10 to 1 early in the war down to just 3 or 4 to 1 today. When you can't get wounded soldiers off the battlefield quickly, far more of them end up dying from injuries that would otherwise have been survivable. Drones are now believed to account for around 70% of all Russian and Ukrainian battlefield casualties combined, and both sides are struggling badly to break through the other's drone wall. Alongside these short-range drone swarms, which typically operate with ranges under 100 kilometers, Ukraine is increasingly deploying intermediate-range drones against Russian logistics targets and long-range drones against the broader Russian economy. The intermediate-range systems reach up to roughly 300 kilometers, and Ukraine's production of them is reportedly 5 times greater in 2026 than it was in 2025, according to Zelensky. Ukraine has used them extensively this year to strike logistics and support infrastructure well behind the front lines: roads, ammunition depots, staging areas, air defense systems, radar installations, and drone warehouses, among other targets. The M14 highway, which runs from the Russian city of Rostov through occupied Mariupol and into Crimea, has come under particularly heavy and sustained attack. Open-source analysts have tracked more than 125 intermediate-range strikes along this single highway in just the past couple of months, destroying dozens of Russian trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and reinforcements headed toward the front. This is severely hampering Russia's ability to keep its forces properly supplied. Russian military bloggers, including figures like Vladimir Romanov, have even claimed these strikes are contributing to fuel shortages in Crimean cities such as Sevastopol. Building countermeasures like protective drone netting along highways takes considerable time to install, and Russian logistics convoys can't simply halt operations while that work gets done. On May 27th, Ukraine's 412th Nemesis Brigade reported that these strikes had already forced Russia to restrict heavy military traffic along sections of the corridor linking occupied Mariupol and Melitopol with Crimea, undermining resupply across the entire southern front. On top of these intermediate and short-range strikes degrading Russian logistics and combat operations, Ukraine is increasingly using long-range drone and missile strikes to damage the broader Russian economy that ultimately funds the entire war effort. With ranges reaching as deep as 1,750 kilometers into Russian territory, these strikes now penetrate 2.5 times farther than they did at the war's start 4 years ago. Ukraine has targeted a wide range of sites, but has particularly focused on Russia's oil and gas infrastructure and maritime export ports, aiming to cut directly into the energy revenue that bankrolls the Kremlin's war machine. After the United States and Israel launched a war against Iran in 2026, and Iran responded in part by blocking the Strait of Hormuz, global oil prices spiked sharply. That fueled widespread expectations that Russia, as one of the world's largest oil exporters, would see a major financial windfall to help fund its military. Instead, across April and May, Ukraine struck at least 20 Russian oil refineries and export terminals. The most dramatic of these strikes came in April, when long-range drones hit the Tuapse oil refinery and export terminal on Russia's Black Sea coast, triggering a massive oil spill that contaminated at least 50 kilometers of coastline. Thick black smoke from the resulting fire drifted as far south as the resort town of Sochi, visible even to airline passengers flying overhead, while rain laced with oil and soot fell on the surrounding area and contaminated the soil. Ukraine has carried out strikes across much of western Russia this year, reaching from St. Petersburg to Moscow to the Caucasus region and nearly as far east as the Ural Mountains. As a result, Bloomberg reported that Russia's seaborne oil exports fell by roughly 300,000 barrels per day in March, while average refinery output across the entire country dropped to 4.69 million barrels per day in April, ominously the lowest level Russia has recorded since December 2009. The windfall Russia expected from Iran war-driven oil prices has been substantially offset by these concentrated long-range strikes, which Ukraine has taken to calling kinetic sanctions. In response, Russian oil and gas companies nationwide have been forced to pour money into expensive countermeasures like signal jammers, heavy-duty metal netting, and even dedicated anti-aircraft systems just to protect their own infrastructure. An additional complication for Russia emerged in February when SpaceX cut off Starlink satellite access within occupied Ukrainian territory. The Russian military had reportedly smuggled in unauthorized Starlink terminals to facilitate battlefield communications and drone operations in those occupied zones. The Ukrainian government worked directly with SpaceX to identify and deactivate these terminals, adding yet another layer of pressure on Russian forces and pushing their drone operators back toward older, more easily detectable antenna systems that Ukrainian counter-drone units can locate and destroy with relative ease. Compounding this, Russia's own crackdown on the Telegram messaging app has created friction within its own ranks. Telegram is the dominant messaging platform across much of the former Soviet bloc, including Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Russia began partially throttling and restricting it in May 2025 and escalated to largely blocking it outright by April 2026. The Russian government claims this is necessary to prevent Ukrainian drones from accessing local mobile networks for targeting purposes, but the move has also conveniently suppressed the ability of protest groups to organize, while pushing ordinary civilians towards state-controlled alternatives that are far easier for authorities to monitor. Since Russian soldiers and officers also relied heavily on Telegram for their own battlefield coordination and logistics communication, the bloc has frustrated their operations as well, compounding the effects of the Starlink ban and the relentless Ukrainian drone campaign. There's also a significant political development that's worked in Ukraine's favor. In April, Hungary's longtime Prime Minister Viktor Orban lost his re-election bid in a landslide to challenger Péter Magyar. This mattered enormously for Ukraine because Orban's government had spent months vetoing and blocking a €90 billion EU loan package intended for Ukraine. With Orban's decisive defeat, Magyar has promised to immediately lift Hungary's veto, clearing the path for Ukraine to receive that loan injection. The funding is interest-free for Ukraine, with Brussels expecting the principal to eventually be repaid through reparations from Russia. Beyond financing, Ukraine is also deepening its defense industrial ties with the broader Western world, which helps ensure continued support even in the absence of formal mutual defense treaties. Germany and Ukraine have signed a deal to jointly produce thousands of AI-enabled intermediate-range drones out of a factory in Bavaria. The UK is co-producing combat drones with Ukraine and Scotland. Denmark is jointly producing rocket fuel with Ukraine and Jutland. Perhaps most notably, after Iranian drones embarrassed American air defense systems in the Persian Gulf by destroying more than $1.3 billion in U.S. military hardware using equipment that cost roughly the price of a few used cars, the United States brought in 201 Ukrainian counter-drone specialists to assist with air defense operations in Saudi Arabia. The more Ukraine innovates in this war, the more valuable expertise and technology it has to offer the rest of the world for the conflicts of tomorrow, which makes it considerably less likely that its allies will walk away. Altogether, Ukraine's strategies appear to be working in 2026. The tide of the war is tangibly shifting, and Russia is running out of viable paths toward even its most minimal objectives, like completing the occupation of Donbass by the end of this year. Given the accumulation of setbacks Ukraine has managed to inflict this year, Putin is likely left with only two genuinely unpalatable choices. One option is to settle for some kind of ceasefire roughly along the current front lines, effectively abandoning the long-stated objective of securing all of Donbass. But Ukraine might not be willing to accept that arrangement while it continues gaining momentum on the battlefield, and hardline factions within Russia who've been promised outright victory would likely view any such compromise as a betrayal. The other option is escalation, ordering another general mobilization that could forcibly deploy roughly 200,000 more Russian soldiers to the front. But that move carries serious political risk for the Kremlin, particularly given how far Putin's own approval ratings have already fallen this year. The only previous general mobilization of this war, back in September 2022, for 300,000 men, triggered an exodus of more than 1 million Russian men of fighting age, fleeing the country to avoid service, and proved deeply unpopular at home. With the Russian economy showing real signs of strain that the government refuses to publicly acknowledge, with the war already standing as Russia's bloodiest conflict since the Second World War, with internet censorship and Ukrainian drone strikes both intensifying simultaneously, with the army stalled out along nearly the entire front, with a documented history of military unrest, including the Wagner Group mutiny back in the summer of 2023, and with Putin's own domestic popularity sitting at a historic low, the central question becomes unavoidable. Would he actually gamble everything on another mobilization order in hopes of finishing off Donbass, or would he ultimately settle for some version of a ceasefire instead? Time will tell. But for now, 2026 is increasingly looking like it could turn out to be Ukraine's year.